Police beat up old woman, but Ronaldo rushes to save her. The evening city buzzed with its usual rhythm. People hurried about their business, streetlights cast a soft glow on the pavement, and the air carried the scent of fresh bread from a bakery on the corner and the faint aroma of coffee from a nearby cafe. Everything seemed ordinary, but it is in moments like these that lives can change forever. Maria Lopez, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a tired expression, carefully placed one foot in front of the other as she walked down the sidewalk, leaning on an old but sturdy cane. In one hand she carried a small grocery bag, bread, milk, some vegetables. Not much, but enough to last her for a couple of days. Despite her frailty, there was a dignity in her movements, a quiet resilience born from a lifetime of endurance. She passed a group of teenagers chatting animatedly outside a supermarket and headed toward the bus stop. But suddenly her path was blocked as a police patrol car pulled up alongside her. The doors opened and two uniformed men stepped out, Officers Bruno and Ricci. "Hey, Granny," Bruno called out lazily. He was a burly man with sharp features and a cold, unreadable gaze. "What are you doing out here so late?" Maria looked up, narrowing her eyes in confusion. "I'm just heading home, officer." "Is that a crime?" Ricci, younger and slimmer, crossed his arms with a smirk. "We got a report about a pickpocket operating in this area. You matched the description." "A pickpocket?" Maria frowned. I just bought some bread at the store. I have nothing but food and my change." "Oh, so you're not only a thief but also a liar?" Bruno stepped closer, looming over her. Maria didn't move, though her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her cane. There was a flash of defiance in her eyes, a fire that hadn't dimmed with age. "I haven't stolen anything, officers. You're welcome to check my pockets." "How generous of you," Ricci sneered. Before Maria could react, he yanked the grocery bag from her hands. Its contents tumbled onto the pavement. The milk bottle shattered, spilling white liquid across the concrete. "What are you doing?" Maria cried, taking a shaky step forward. "Checking," Bruno replied with a grin, rummaging through her bag as though he expected to find stolen goods. "What do we have here?" "Oh wow, a whole haul, bread and tomatoes. You really thought you could fool us?" Maria clenched her jaw, her lips trembling with anger, but she knew that arguing with the police was as pointless as talking to a brick wall. "Enough," she said firmly. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Oh yeah." Ricci took a step closer, and before Maria could move away, he shoved her shoulder. She didn't have time to brace herself. Her legs buckled and she crashed onto the hard pavement, hitting her side against the curb. Her cane fell with a hollow clatter beside her. "That's better," Bruno snorted. "Now maybe you'll tell the truth." Maria struggled to push herself up, her breathing shallow. Pain shot through her knee, but worse than that was the sense of helplessness. "Help me?" Her voice was barely a whisper. A small crowd had gathered nearby. Some people stood frozen, others had pulled out their phones recording the scene. But no one stepped in. No one wanted to get involved. Bruno turned to the onlookers, smirking. "You all understand that this woman is breaking the law, right? She's obstructing pedestrian traffic, resisting police orders. We're just doing our job." Silence. Some people looked away, others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Maria gritted her teeth and pressed her palm against the ground, trying once more to rise, but Ricci grabbed her wrist and yanked her up roughly. "Get up, old lady," he sneered. "Or do we have to help?" "I can," she gasped, but before she could finish, pain flared in her wrist. Bruno lifted his boot and stomped down on her cane, snapping it in half. Maria froze, her heart pounding. "Why?" she managed to whisper. "So you know your place," Ricci chuckled. At that moment, the sharp screech of tires pierced the air. A black SUV came to a sudden halt just a few meters away. The door swung open and a tall figure stepped onto the street. People immediately recognized him. Cristiano Ronaldo. The air grew still. Even Bruno and Ricci hesitated for a fraction of a second, realizing who was standing before them. Ronaldo took a step forward, his face an unreadable mask. His fists were clenched, his entire posture radiating quiet authority. "What's going on here?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Bruno tried to maintain control of the situation. He squared his shoulders and crossed his arms over his chest. "This is none of your business, Mr. Ronaldo. We're maintaining order." Ronaldo looked down at Maria, who was still trembling, her wrinkled hands struggling to keep steady. "Is that so?" His voice was icy. "This is what you call order?" The crowd whispered among themselves. Some had already started live streaming. There were plenty of videos of the incident, but now the world's most famous footballer was standing in the middle of it. Bruno felt a trickle of sweat on his temple. "This woman has legal issues," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Ronaldo didn't take his eyes off him. Then, slowly he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone and turned on the camera. "Say that again," he said. Silence. Maria struggled to steady her breath, looking up at her unexpected savior. In her eyes, there was a faint glimmer of hope, hope that had been missing just moments ago. The crowd held its breath. The game was just beginning. Ronaldo's fingers tightened around his phone as he held it up, his camera now capturing the faces of the two officers. His eyes remained locked on Bruno, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. The crowd around them had grown, people whispering, recording, their faces a mix of shock and quiet anticipation. Some still hesitated, unsure whether to intervene, but the presence of Ronaldo had shifted the energy of the moment. The power dynamic had begun to crack. Bruno straightened his back, his face twisting into something between annoyance and concern. Ricci shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching as though itching to reach for his baton. "I said," Ronaldo's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable authority to it. "Repeat what you just said. Let the whole world hear it." Bruno licked his lips, casting a glance toward Ricci. For the first time, the weight of their actions seemed to dawn on them. They hadn't just harassed some helpless old woman in the dark. They had done it in front of an audience, and now that audience had one of the most recognizable faces in the world standing in the center. "Turn that off," Bruno finally said, his voice lower now. "You have no right to record police activity." Ronaldo arched a brow. "I have every right when I see an innocent woman being beaten on the street." Maria, still trembling, tried to push herself up onto her knees. Ronaldo immediately crouched down beside her, his large hand resting lightly on her shoulder. His grip was firm, reassuring but gentle. "Senora, are you hurt?" he asked, his voice dropping into something softer. Maria blinked up at him as if struggling to comprehend the moment. Her frail body shook with exhaustion and fear, but the kindness in Ronaldo's face was undeniable. "My leg, my wrist," she whispered. Ronaldo's jaw clenched. His eyes flicked back up to the officers, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "You broke her cane," he said, his voice colder now. "And you assaulted her." Ricci let out a short laugh, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Look, superstar, I don't know what fantasy you've built up in your head, but this woman was resisting police orders." "By existing?" Ronaldo shot back, his voice sharp. The crowd murmured in agreement. The balance of power had fully shifted now. No one was backing the police officers. People whispered into their phones, messaging friends, sharing the live stream, flooding social media with questions. Then the first sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Bruno and Ricci's faces paled. A second patrol car screeched around the corner, coming to a sudden halt beside the scene. The doors swung open and a senior officer, Captain Alvarez, stepped out. His uniform was crisp, his movements precise. He was a man who had been in the force for years, and even from the way he walked, it was clear he wasn't the kind to tolerate trouble, especially when it involved bad PR. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, the crowd, the shattered cane, the elderly woman trembling on the pavement, and then finally Cristiano Ronaldo standing in front of his men, phone still in hand, recording everything. "What the hell is going on here?" Alvarez demanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Bruno swallowed. "Sir, this woman—" "Save it," Alvarez snapped, already sensing that whatever explanation Bruno had wasn't going to hold water. "I've been getting calls from headquarters for the last 10 minutes about this incident." His gaze turned back to Ronaldo. "Mr. Ronaldo, I assume you have something to add?" Ronaldo nodded, slipping his phone into his pocket. "This woman," he said, gesturing toward Maria, "was harassed, accused of a crime she didn't commit, thrown to the ground, and had her cane broken by your officers." His tone was razor-sharp now. "They struck her. And they thought they could get away with it?" Alvarez's lips thinned. His eyes darkened as they flickered back toward his men. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Bruno hesitated. Ricci opened his mouth, but whatever excuse he was about to give died in his throat. He looked at Bruno, silently begging for an answer. Alvarez's face hardened. "I see." Then, before either officer could react, he turned toward the two officers who had arrived with him. "Cuff them." Bruno's face turned red. "What?" "You heard me," Alvarez said coolly. "Excessive force, abuse of authority, and public endangerment." Ricci's eyes widened in disbelief. "Captain, you can't be serious." "Serious?" Alvarez repeated, stepping closer. His voice remained dangerously soft, but his words hit like a hammer. You just assaulted an old woman on camera. In front of Ronaldo. And now the entire world knows it? The officers behind him didn't hesitate. They stepped forward, grabbing Bruno and Ricci's wrists, twisting them behind their backs, and locking the handcuffs with crisp clicks. The crowd erupted into murmurs, then applause. Maria let out a shaky breath, tears forming in her tired eyes as she looked up at Ronaldo, disbelief washing over her. Is it over? She whispered. Ronaldo smiled gently, brushing a few strands of gray hair from her forehead. It's over? He turned back to Alvarez. She needs medical attention. Alvarez nodded. We'll get an ambulance. Then after a moment he sighed and met Ronaldo's gaze. I won't pretend we don't have problems in this department, Mr. Ronaldo. But this is a disaster. It's more than that, Ronaldo said, his voice quieter now. It's a disease. And it needs to be cured. The crowd continued recording as Bruno and Ricci were escorted to the second patrol car. People whispered, some shaking their heads, others still in awe of what they had just witnessed. The presence of Ronaldo had turned what might have been another injustice swept under the rug into an international scandal. A few minutes later, an ambulance arrived, paramedics stepping out to check on Maria. One of them knelt beside her, carefully examining her wrist. We'll take you to the hospital, the paramedic said. You'll be all right, Senora. Maria looked hesitant, as if unsure whether she should accept help. Ronaldo leaned down and smiled. I'll go with you, he assured her. Her lips trembled before she nodded. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, Ronaldo walked beside her, his presence steady, comforting. The cameras followed them, the moment being broadcast across the world. Before stepping into the ambulance, Ronaldo turned back toward the crowd. His gaze swept across them, so many faces, so many people who had watched, filmed, and hesitated. Next time, he said, his voice carrying through the quiet street, don't wait for someone else to stop it. And with that, he climbed into the ambulance, the doors shutting behind him. The sirens wailed once more as they drove away, leaving behind a city forever changed. The ambulance moved steadily through the streets, the rhythmic wail of the sirens echoing into the night. Inside, Maria lay on the stretcher, her frail fingers gripping the blanket draped over her. Despite the exhaustion etched into her features, her eyes remained alert, darting between the paramedic checking her vitals and Ronaldo, who sat beside her. The paramedic gently pressed against her swollen wrist, nodding slightly. You're lucky. It's not broken, just badly bruised. Your knee will need some rest, but there are no fractures. Maria exhaled shakily. I don't feel very lucky. Ronaldo leaned in, his dark eyes filled with quiet concern. You are now, he said softly. You're safe. Maria swallowed hard. The reality of what had just happened was settling in, and for the first time, her body began to tremble, not just from the pain but from the sheer weight of it all. She had been thrown to the ground, humiliated, beaten in the middle of a city where she had spent her entire life. If Ronaldo hadn't arrived, she didn't even want to think about how much worse it could have been. Her lip quivered. They were going to kill me? Ronaldo reached out, placing a warm hand over hers. His grip was firm, steady. No, they weren't. I wouldn't have let them. A small, shaky laugh escaped her lips. You appeared out of nowhere, like an angel. Ronaldo smirked, shaking his head. I wouldn't go that far. But Maria wasn't exaggerating. She had felt so small, so powerless, as the officers crushed her dignity beneath their boots. Then, suddenly, one of the most famous men in the world had arrived and everything had changed. Maria turned her head toward him, her gaze filled with something deeper than gratitude. Why did you stop? Most people, they just watched. Ronaldo's expression darkened slightly, his jaw tightening. Because no one should have to go through that alone. Maria stared at him for a long moment, searching his face as if seeing something that the cameras and flashing lights never captured. Have you? She asked softly. Ronaldo's posture remained composed, but something flickered behind his eyes. A shadow of something deeper, something heavier. He didn't answer immediately, and that silence was enough of a response. Maria's heart ached, not just for herself but for him. The ambulance took a sharp turn, and the hospital came into view. A crowd had already gathered outside. Reporters, photographers, people holding up their phones, flashing lights cutting through the night like tiny explosions. Maria's stomach knotted. I don't want all this attention. Ronaldo glanced out the window, then back at her. Don't worry. I'll take care of it. The ambulance came to a halt, and within seconds the doors swung open. The blinding flash of cameras flooded the space. Journalists shouted questions, their voices colliding into a wall of chaotic noise. Ronaldo, what happened? Who is the woman? Did the police really attack her? Are you pressing charges? Do you think this will spark a larger movement? The paramedics moved swiftly, pushing Maria's stretcher forward, but the noise and flashing lights made her dizzy. Her breath quickened. Then Ronaldo moved. He stepped in front of her, shielding her from the cameras like an impenetrable wall. His towering frame blocked most of the reporters' view, and the air suddenly felt different, heavier, charged. He raised a hand, silencing them without needing to say a word. The crowd fell into an uneasy hush. Ronaldo exhaled slowly before speaking, his voice carrying over the silence. You all want a statement? His tone was cold, controlled. Fine. The reporters braced themselves, cameras aimed, ready to capture whatever he was about to say. This woman, he gestured toward Maria, who watched him with wide eyes, is someone's mother. Someone's grandmother. She is a human being who was attacked for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. His words struck like thunder, making the crowd shift uncomfortably. What happened tonight was disgusting. Two men who swore to serve and protect chose to abuse their power instead. They thought no one would stop them. They thought they could get away with it. He took a slow breath, his gaze scanning the reporters, daring them to challenge him. But they didn't get away with it. The crowd stirred. This is not just about one incident, he continued. This is about the world we live in. It's about the people who look away when they see injustice because they don't want to get involved. It's about power being used to control instead of protect. He let his words sink in before delivering the final blow. This stops now. For a moment no one spoke. No one moved. Even the journalists who were trained to twist words and control narratives seemed frozen under the weight of what they had just heard. Ronaldo's jaw tensed. No more questions. With that, he turned back to Maria and walked beside her as the paramedics wheeled her into the hospital. Behind them, the world was already reacting. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere was quieter but no less intense. Doctors and nurses moved quickly, assessing Maria's injuries. Ronaldo remained by her side, refusing to leave even as the medical staff assured him she would be fine. Maria, lying on the hospital bed, turned her head toward him with tired eyes. You don't have to stay. Ronaldo pulled up a chair and sat down, stretching his long legs out in front of him. I know. She studied him for a moment, then sighed. You remind me of my son. Ronaldo's lips curved slightly. Yeah? He was stubborn too. They shared a quiet chuckle before Maria's expression softened. Do you think anything will change? Ronaldo's smile faded, replaced by something more somber. I think change is slow. Too slow. But moments like this? They matter. Maria nodded, her fingers tightening slightly around the blanket. I hope so. Ronaldo glanced toward the window where the city lights glowed in the distance. It will? A nurse walked in holding a clipboard. Mrs. Lopez, we'll keep you overnight for observation. Everything looks good, but we want to be sure. Maria sighed, nodding. Thank you. The nurse turned to Ronaldo. You've done a good thing tonight? Ronaldo shook his head. No. I did what anyone should do. The nurse smiled sadly. Maybe. But not everyone does. Ronaldo looked down at Maria, who was already fighting sleep, exhaustion pulling her under. He reached into his bag, pulling out something carefully wrapped in fabric. This is for you? Maria blinked sleepily, her fingers fumbling to unwrap it. A Portugal jersey. But not just any jersey. It was signed with a simple message written across the back. You are not invisible. Tears welled in her eyes. Ronaldo patted her shoulder. Rest now. She nodded, clutching the jersey to her chest. As he stood and turned to leave, his phone buzzed. A flood of notifications. The world was watching. Protests were already starting. People were demanding justice. Ronaldo exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He hadn't set out to start a revolution, but maybe it was time for one. As he stepped out into the night, the city seemed different. Louder. Awake. And for the first time in a long time, he had hoped that this moment would not be forgotten. Because people like Maria deserved more than survival. They deserved justice. And justice was long overdue.